The Siege of Orgun, Afghanistan, 1983. This is a war game published by Revolution Games. It comes in a Ziploc bag, so this is the cover, which also doubles as a player aid. This is a game that depicts an episode of the Soviet-Afghan War and precisely the attempt of the Mujahideen to take control of this area around Orgun, and also to take control of several outposts and an airfield there. The Mujahideen are trying to take control of these areas out of the hand of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, at the time backed by the Soviets. The two sides play in very different ways, and one of the ways that the game uses to depict the non-symmetry is by using unique decks of cards. By the way, this is an area impulse game, as you probably figured out just by looking at the map, and in several ways the game reminds me of Storm over Stalingrad, a classic area impulse game. Very famous, it has been very popular in the last decade in wargaming circles, and it also is a game that I happened to review recently. Just like in that game, you have a strong siege atmosphere here. There is a side that is stuck trying to force the opponent not to take control of key areas. The difference in Storm over Stalingrad is you have the Soviets on one side and the Germans on the other side pushing to reach the Volga. Here we have the besieged side in the middle of the board with enemies that are trying to take control of the central area coming from here and from here. So interesting situation. Something similar to Storm over Stalingrad also is the fact that the game is card assisted and cards play a big role. Just like in that game, each player has a unique deck of cards, and the number of cards that you receive depends on the numbers printed on the turn track. In different turns, people will receive different amounts of cards. That means different amounts of special resources, and that adds flavor because, of course, the tide will turn. Things will be harder or easier depending on where the situation is. Later in the game, also in the last couple of turns, the DRA player also may receive Soviet reinforcements, units that enter the board. Other reinforcements may be created by card play, and the same applies to the Mujahideen player. Just to give you a sense, these cards do a really good job of creating interesting play situations, play options, but also in creating a strong sense of theme. So, for example, the Mujahideen may be able to convince some of the people that are working with the DRA to defect and go with them. On the opposite end, the Soviets may be able to exploit the tribal conflicts and to prevent the Mujahideen units from working in a combined fashion. The DRA player controls, yes, a more homogeneous group of units. These are some of the initial units for that player. And since we're here, we can also look at the units that have 3 values. I have 3 values printed on them. The first value is attack, the second is attack and defense also, just firepower. The second is cohesion, which is used in several tests, and the last value is movement. You also have some leaders. Of course, I can't find them. I'll show you a leader from the Mujahideen. You also have some leaders that will mainly grant bonuses. That is a bonus to the cohesion unit that is stacked with the Mujahideen, that are working with the Mujahideen. With the leader. Now, the Mujahideen units are divided in 3 groups, and in fact, as you can see, the counters are of different colors, and there are problems here. A leader, for example, can lend his bonus only to units of the same color, and there are cards that the DRA player may use that would exploit the fact that the tribes do not always get along very well. And so, for example, there are units of different tribes in the same area. There is a card that the DRA player can play that will exploit that and will basically block the action in that area. As for the map shows that there's an area impulse game, pretty typical. In each area you have an identification with 2 pieces of information in it. One is a number that simply identifies the area to differentiate it from the other ones, and then you also have a terrain modifier that usually helps the defender. Also, the shape of that, the shape of the identification tells you whether that is regular desert or mountain. Mountains are represented by triangles, and also some areas have that different edges you can see there, and that represents a fortified area. Now, at the beginning of the game, as I said, the units of the DRA player are placed in the middle of the board, and the Mujahideen units are coming from different directions. Players alternate taking impulses, and as it happens in games of this type, when it is your turn to have an impulse, to use one of your impulses, you activate an area on the board, and then you may activate any and all units in the area. You may also choose not to activate the units, you simply activate the area and then you pass with your units so that the units remain fresh. Like in similar games of this kind, units can be in one or two states, well, three technically if you count being eliminated, but when they're on the board, they can be fresh with this side face up, or they can be spent, and they become spent after performing an action or after suffering a negative combat result. And then the next thing after being spent, the next bad thing that happens to them, well, maybe to retreat or maybe to be eliminated. So you activate an area, and then you can activate units in them, and units that are activated can perform one of several actions. They can move, and movement costs, you spend movement points, and movement costs are based not so much on terrain, even though there is a road bonus if you're moving along a road, but mainly they're based on the presence of enemy units. That is, moving in areas adjacent to enemies or entering areas that contain enemy units is more expensive, costs more movement points, which is very important for the Mujahideen, because the Mujahideen are not very fast. They mostly have movement factors of 3, so when they need to spend 2 movement points to move adjacent to an enemy, that means that very often they have to stop in an area that is next to adjacent. Then next turn they move to adjacent, and then the following turn move there. Or this time they do like 1, 2, 3, and then next turn. So they are slowed down as they approach. They start moving more cautiously, which to me makes sense. Yes, regular movement cost is like 1 if you're not moving adjacent or in areas containing enemy units, and 2 movement points if you're moving adjacent or into an area containing enemy units. When you move, and if you move in an area that contains enemy units, an attack happens. Incidentally, if you just look at the values, you already get a sense of some of the unique features, or so the different features of the two sides. The DRA units are stronger, tougher, buffer, but also there aren't many of them. The Mujahideen overwhelm the DRA units with their numbers, but individually they're not nearly as strong. So when units are in this, enemy units are in the same area, combat will occur, and we'll talk about that in a second. Oh, well, why that? Well, let's talk about that now. To resolve combat, you total the firepower of the attacking units, in this case the Mujahideen. Other modifiers may apply from card play, for example, from playing the Night Attack that gives you a +3. This is a super powerful card, and the Mujahideen have quite a few of those. And then you also roll a single d6, and you total all that, and you have the attack factor, the total attack factor. For a defender, you total the firepower of the defending units, plus 3 modifiers, plus other modifiers that may come from card play. And also you roll a d6, add all that together, and you compare the total attack value with the total defense value. If the total attack is higher than the defense, then the defender takes a number of hits that is equal to the difference between the two values, and hits must be absorbed by turning fresh units to their spent side, retreating units, and or eliminating units. It can be done in different combinations. This is something common in area impulse games, and it's really part of the strategy to figure out the best way of absorbing hits in each situation. If the number of total of the attack value is not higher than that of the defense, then the attack is unsuccessful and the attacker has to retreat and become spent. By the way, the attacker becomes spent anyways because you become spent at the end of every action that you perform. After you perform an action, the units that acted become spent. Another interesting thing that you can do is to perform the special actions. An action, for example, is the ambush. The ambush has several restrictions, but if the restrictions don't apply, if you can figure out when to do it. So, for example, if the terrain is right, you cannot ambush enemy units if the terrain modifier is 0. You cannot ambush the enemy units if too many of them are in an area. But if the conditions are right, you can stop moving enemy units. You can move one of your units in there, declare that there is an ambush. Then the targeted unit has to take a cohesion test, which is taken by rolling a d6 and possibly applying modifiers. The test is passed if the total is equal to or lower than the cohesion value. And if the test is passed, then nothing happens to the moving units. It can keep moving. The ambushing unit is spent. And but if the if the cohesion test is not passed, then the moving unit has to stop and also becomes spent. Another thing that you can do is to launch a raid. Only the Mujahideen player can do that. To launch a raid, you again move in one of your enemy units. You target a single enemy unit, and this time it is the attacking, the raiding unit that takes a cohesion test. If the cohesion test is passed, the target unit is spent and must retreat from the area, so that's very good for displacing enemy units from areas where you want to enter. If the raiding unit fails the cohesion test, then the raid is unsuccessful and the raiding unit has to retreat and becomes spent. These are pretty much the basics. There is a supply element. You need to make sure that you don't run out of supply or will suffer penalties. The game has conditions that may cause automatic early victory. The DRA player can claim automatic victory if he wipes out 2 of the Mujahideen tribes entirely, which is pretty tough to do. The Mujahideen player wins if he controls the area, this central area here in Orgun, and also there is another group of areas here, and there is that orange border around there. If during gameplay the Mujahideen player controls this area and one of these other areas within the orange perimeter, then there is automatic victory. Otherwise, victory goes to until the end of the game and depends on the areas that the Mujahideen player controls or contests at the end of the game. If a sufficient number of key areas are controlled by the Mujahideen player or contested, then the Mujahideen player wins the game. Otherwise, the DRA player is the winner of the game. I like this game. I really do. It has a lot of interesting elements. In general, it seems to me like it's almost like a smaller version of Storm over Stalingrad, a game that I played some time ago and I only reviewed recently. Not that necessarily this has to be derivative, it just is a certain resemblance between the two games. This game being much smaller, faster to play, on a smaller scale, easier and faster to set up, but still with that siege element that works very well in Storm over Stalingrad, and with cards that feel very thematic and also very functional to the design. They add flavor, they add theme, they really make you experience the specific struggles that the two sides had to face, defections, problem with supplies, stuff like that. At the same time, they also add to the game mechanics in that they make the challenge interesting. They add game effects. They add game effects that really contribute to give you interesting decisions and to pack in a couple of really tough punches against the opponent. But both players have some really powerful cards, so things get balanced there. They kind of like balance each other out. As for the pace and the feel of the game, what is good about these games, about Era Impulse games in general, is that the back and forth is pretty fast because you activate an area, you activate units in there, etc., but you immediately resolve. The game goes immediately back to your opponent, so you do not have to wait and sit through a turn while the opponent moves all of their units. So the back and forth is really interesting, and you constantly are reacting to what the opponent does. Very often you see there's a sort of like cascade of events. Activate this area, then you activate the one right by, then activate the one right by the one you just did, and so on and so forth. But the back and forth is really fast, is really neat. And here, what is really cool, what I really like, is that this back and forth really leads to a tense situation. The two sides play in very different ways. They are completely non-symmetrical. From the DRA that has fewer but very strong units to the Mujahideen player that has these hordes of disorganized but very enthusiastic people that can just overwhelm the opponent with sheer numbers. So you have to play in completely different ways. As the Soviet player, you have to try not to get surrounded by the Mujahideen, which is tough when you have like one guy and the opponent has like 12 in the surrounding areas. Also, you have to be careful as the DRA player not to become victim of ambushes, so you need to kind of like keep your units together. But again, you do not have many, so if you form groups that are good to defend against ambushes, then you are creating other problems because concentration, again, may create problems with your supplies. There are just a lot of interesting problems that the players had to face. And as I said, what I really like here is that there was this tension that came from the fact that the Soviet player, the DRA/Soviet player, seems to be at a disadvantage. I found that side to be harder to play than the other side, but the disproportion there was not too overwhelming. And what was interesting is that it felt like the DRA Soviet player was constantly almost going to lose the game, almost constantly going to have a major blow, destroying some of their units and pretty much sealing the fate of the conflict. Because when a side doesn't have many units, if you feel like they're going to lose two, then pretty much you're going to lose the fight, you're going to lose the battle. But what I liked is that while the Soviet player constantly looked like was going to be overwhelmed, was going to be crushed, was going to be completely submerged by the hordes of Mujahideen, yet by combining Era Impulse maneuvers, mixing retreats and spending units in a wise way, playing card effects, receiving reinforcements, exploiting terrain advantages. It just felt like the Mujahideen was always going to win next turn, but somehow next turn the Mujahideen wasn't winning. Well, the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So I found that the two sides really can create an interesting confrontation and can exploit their unique their unique advantages, their unique strengths. But they do so in a situation that appears to be fragile, that appears to always be on the verge of catastrophe for one of the two sides, which makes the game very interesting, as opposed to like, well, I'm setting up my situation now in 20 turns, so 4 or 5 hours that we play, it'll probably pay off. No, here you see constant feedback from the board, the situation is constantly altered. And again, as the DRA player, that's the side that I like to play, precisely because I find it more nail-biting. You're always constantly on the verge of disaster. You always feel like you're gonna lose the game next turn, and then you feel like you have like one maneuver away, one card away from losing the game. But if you manage not to get there, then you can try to survive for as long as you can. So I found the challenge to be very interesting. And if you find, as you play one of the two sides to be overpowered, you find that the game is not balanced based on your style of play, well, then the game is short enough that you can definitely play two games back to back in a single play session, and then you use the classic a trick of playing two games and reverting sides, and so you see which player does best with the Soviet side, for example, which player takes long, or whatever it is, the side that you may be struggling with. So I like it. I like the game very much. I think it's very well produced. The rules are pretty clear. The components are very good quality, and gameplay really is a joy. This is a small game, reminds me of the Battle of Yashima that I played earlier last week, which was very similar, same publisher, similar format, and even same mechanics, Era Impulse. I don't know how long it has been since I played an Era Impulse game, but it was fun to go back to that system and play 2 games of this type. In any case, a good game, really good game. I find it very friendly to the solitaire player. Even if no one is around, you can play the game both sides to the best of your possibilities. Yes, cards are there. Some people find that element is incompatible with solitaire gaming, but I don't. Yes, there are some pretty powerful effects here, but I didn't find that knowing what the other side had in their hand creates the situation that really dampen my enjoyment of the game. So solitaire friendly can also be easily used as an introductory war game, maybe an introduction to Era Impulse games. There are the ones that are very simple and basic, such as Storm over Stalingrad, but this one could be another option. And kudos to the designer for gaming a battle, gaming a conflict that definitely is not one of the most popular in wargaming. Always refreshing to explore new areas of wargaming after playing, the games about the traditional, the most game battles, their dance, D-Day, etc., etc., etc. Definitely there aren't as many games on this subject as there are on those other ones. Really good game, recommended to the solitaire wargamer, to the beginner wargamer, and simply to the wargamer. It's a good game, really good game.